Hello, welcome to this EAA webinar, where we're going to be looking back at the report that just came out with in 2020, forecasting their predictions and their suggested focuses for assessment over the next 5 years. And as we are 5 years later, it felt sensible to look back at the report and see how much of that still holds true, how much has changed. There's been a lot that's happened in those last 5 years, which we'll dig into a little bit more as we talk through the various questions that we're going to raise. And I'm going to raise those with a wonderful panel of experts from across the industry. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because they'll do a much better job of it than I will. But I'm joined by Dr. Maren Deepwell, Paula Goddard, and Gemma Westwood. It's really great to have you all here. And I'm going to ask them if they can just introduce themselves and give a little bit of a perspective on where they think we are with assessment right now. And then we'll dive into the questions that we've been chatting through about the report and where we've got to. So if I can kick off with perhaps Paula. This was Paula's idea, I must say, so thank you very much, Paula, for suggesting it. Paula, do you want to just introduce yourself and give us your quick perspective on the assessment market?
Yes, we were all discussing this 5 years ago on the EAA podcast, and as then and now, I'm still an examiner and have worked with many of the UK awarding bodies over the last 25 years. And I started off in the usual way of marking exam papers on bits of paper, GNVQs. And then I've moved on gradually to become a chief examiner of the diplomas, which have sadly disappeared. But I still like to keep my hand in, and I like to look at up-and-coming specifications and review and revise exam papers and questions that come through in my area, which is engineering mostly, and also IT. And what's going on in assessment is, well, it's been rumbling on for years and years. I mean, anyone who's been involved with awarding bodies over the last couple of decades will have seen that they've been trying and tested and researched online marking using on digital pens was one that came and went, where the candidate would actually write with a electric biro onto the piece of paper, and the biro would capture their writing digitally, which is almost the same now, where people write onto bits of paper which are then sent off to the awarding body, and they are scanned digitally and then marked online. But the awarding bodies are going ahead, and we're seeing really exciting moves over in Wales, where they're talking about their latest GCSEs, where they will want to be online marking and online proctoring where possible. So I think the future is quite bright, and we are actually still moving forward, although very, very slowly.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paula. And it's interesting, actually, and it's a complete aside, but I am a bit of a Trekkie and a sci-fi person. And if any of you watch Stargate Atlantis, they have those very digital pens there being used by the staff, positioned as being really futuristic. And as you say, it's actually quite old hat now, that technology. But I suppose back then when they were making them, it was very advanced. Maren, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your perspective on the assessment market?
Hey everybody, really glad to be here. A big Star Trek fan, so I'm totally with you, Matt, in the nostalgia for things that seemed very futuristic then, and are becoming more of the norm now. So I at the time when this JISC report was being produced in 2019 and in the lead up to 2020, I was the chief executive of the Association for Learning Technology, the UK's leading professional body for learning technology. And many of the members of OLD contributed to this report. And I was just reading it through in the preparation for this webinar. And it was amazing how many, further and higher education experts really contributed to the work in this. So I'm really interested in revisiting that today and kind of diving into, how well the predictions have held up and where we might go from here. Now, over the last 18 months, since my departure from OLD, I've continued to work with learning technologists stepping into leadership roles, and that's really what I'm doing now full time. And it's an exciting space to kind of think about accreditation in a lifelong learning context, which is where I work now, kind of thinking about how what we do at school or university kind of shapes what's happening in the workplace, and what the vocational education space kind of looks like as well, where we have a lot of lifelong learning journeys being documented, accredited, micro accredited, and so on and so forth. And also kind of thinking about the employer side of this. So I guess I'm really interested in the bigger sort of policy perspective, and also exploring kind of where we go from here.
Fantastic. Thanks, Maren. And Gemma.
Yes, yeah, thank you for having me on. I feel like a bit of the newbie to this kind of group, as 5 years ago I was working at an FE institution as an internal quality assurer, but since then I've joined the University of Birmingham as a senior digital education developer, and I'm also the co-chair of the fairly new Alt Digital Assessment SIG as well. So I'd like to think I hopefully have a bit of a finger on the pulse as to what people on the ground are saying at the moment, and the kind of experiences of those individual alt members in their individual educational locations, and can hopefully bring that kind of perspective to the talk that we're doing today. In terms of where I think assessment is, I feel like the main elephant in the room, and I'm sure it's going to come up a lot today, is generative AI and how we deal with that in assessment. And that does, I feel, kind of dominate the conversation around assessments at the moment as well. And I think sometimes it can be a little bit easy to forget that actually digital assessment isn't just all about AI. There's lots of other things involved in digital assessments, from the technology we use, the way that technology is procured, and how we make sure that those particular assessments are accessible for students overall. So I'm really quite interested to take a look at where we were 5 years ago, where we are now, and where we might possibly be in 5 years' time.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, and it's interesting, actually, and not wanting to focus too much on AI right at the beginning, but of course, when the report came out, the AI, the ChatGPT thing really hadn't happened. And although AI has been around for a long, long time, it's really only come into the public psyche since the ChatGPT launch. So it'll be interesting to see how that can sit alongside and coexist with JISC's 5 targets as well. And we might get a chance to talk a little bit about that. And I think the other thing that's just come up there, which is really, really important, is the chalk-faced practitioner. The people who are actually using this are at the heart of any change and innovation. But I sometimes worry that the policymakers don't take that into account when they come up with these grand ideas and plans, and that's not meant to be directed at JISC in any way, shape, or form. But it's interesting when you get these politicians, particularly, standing up and talking about new things they're going to do. I don't know whether they really think about those people at the chalk face, thinking, how are they going to implement this? And just a personal sort of reflection on this for a minute. I think it's really difficult to make predictions, and we know that. And despite that, by the way, I am going to ask our panelists to make some predictions at the end of this. So I'm going to be a bit unfair and ask them to think about what this might look like in 5 years' time. But predictions are really difficult, and they're even more difficult within the risk-averse education sector that we all work in. And I was thinking, as I was preparing for this, back to 2004. For those of you who may remember this, there was a gentleman called Ken Boston, who was the chief executive of the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority, as it was back then, who made some really interesting predictions about how he thought educational assessment would move forward over a 5-year period. And in fact, more than predictions, he mandated this. He said, this is what I want the assessment bodies to do. I want them to take these changes forward and implement them. And just looking at the list of the changes he was thinking about, so there's some key, I won't read the whole lot, but the ones that really jump out at me. So all awarding bodies accepting and assessing e-portfolios. So e-portfolios have been around for a long time, and they're a really good way of getting an all-round picture of what a student's capability is, but we're still not really using them in high-stakes assessment. It says most GCSEs, AS and A-level examinations would be available optionally on screen, well, we're just about starting to get there now, and we think Ken was talking about this in 2004. It's a bit more than 5 years ago now. Curriculum tests available on screen for schools who want to use them. Well, if you live in Wales or in Scotland, that's true. But if you live in England or in other parts of the world, there's variance as well. That's not always necessarily the case. Oh, and this is a biggie. And we talked, Maren and Paula and I talked about this in the last one. On-demand assessments becoming a feature for GCSEs and other high-stakes exams. That's definitely not happened. We all still adhere to this Big Bang assessment model. And it's interesting also, of course, if you think about it, that change is always difficult to implement. But I believe that in the last 5 years, there have been two seismic events within educational assessments, both of which have had their effect, not necessarily positive. I won't say any more than that. The first was a gentleman called Michael Gove, and the second was COVID-19, both of which had an impact in the way that we assess, particularly in the schools sector, but also in other sectors too. So change is possible, but often we need something to guide us along the way and that route to change. And I guess that's really where the JISC report came in. It was trying to give guidance around the way that people approach assessment. And for those of you who've not had a chance to read the report, I would recommend it because I do think it's a really useful document. They came up with 5 principles for assessment. And they were all about trying to make sure that there was a clear focus in any assessment that was delivered around the authenticity of that assessment, around its accessibility, around the appropriate use of automation to lessen workload on teachers and markers and everything else. But that keyword appropriate there, I think. Making more use of continuous assessment so that it's not all about the performance on a wet Tuesday in June in a big gymnasium, and about delivering assessment securely so that we can all be sure that we can rely on the results of that, the students as well as the teachers and the employers who then make decisions on it. And reflecting back on what we talked about when Maren and Paula and I met 5 years ago, well, nearly 5 years ago, to talk about this. Some of the key things that came out, and I thought it was quite interesting just to throw these in to the mix now. The first one was we all acknowledged that we've been talking about change in assessment for a very long time. And it is happening, but it's happening at a slower rate perhaps than some people predict. We recognized that COVID had a definite role in that change, in the more recent change. And that those JISC principles, the 5 principles, were all really good, we thought, on the whole, really good focuses. But as a point that you made, Maren, which particularly resonated with me, they don't mean the same to all stakeholders in all different parts of the market. So some people will be able to apply them better than others, depending on their circumstances. Paula, you made the point that we need to make sure that there's still a clear focus on what it is we're trying to assess, rather than just changing for changing's sake. What are we trying to get out of this assessment, and thus figure out the best way to deliver it. The other thing that we talked about was that it's not all about using technology. Now, technology is really good at scaling and making things more efficient, but we also acknowledge that technology, where it has a role in assessment, needs to be for the betterment of the assessment, not just for improving efficiency and scale. But that it also needs to be focused on, like I was just saying, going back to the comment I made, a reference that Paula made about deciding what it is we want to assess and making sure that we're making change to be able to assess those things that we want to assess more clearly. I think those were the main ones, although the final one I wanted to mention, was that we know that education is often risk averse, but that there's sometimes a greater risk in doing nothing than being scared of making change. And that was something that we were quite acutely aware of when we were talking through these things. And I think, JISC's aim with the 5 principles was to give people a framework around which they could work to bring about change that would be for the betterment of the assessment and all the things that we've just mentioned. So without further ado, we're going to go into some questions. that the panel and I had talked about in advance. If you've got comments or questions that you want to pose to us, then obviously please do. There is a comment area in the live stream if you're joining us directly in StreamYard. So please do put any questions that you have onto the screen, and we will try to get to those as we go through the webinar. The first question, though, was really reflects on the fact that one of the significant things that's happened since these 5 principles came out was COVID-19, and that had a significant impact on the market. And Maren, I'd like to put this question to you, if that's all right. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on whether COVID-19 helped or hindered a greater focus around the areas that JISC mentions in their report.
Thanks, Matt. And yeah, I mean, let's kind of reflect, because I think assessment is part of a wider learning and teaching kind of package, if you like. Learning, teaching, and assessment were all vastly impacted, as were all students and staff. And I suppose when it comes to technology and particularly innovation, the pandemic really put everything in an emergency context, which helped us, I suppose, see what's possible at scale. All the thousands of teachers who were sent home with a laptop one afternoon and were suddenly doing a fully online class for the next 6 months, the next day from their kitchen tables. It was possible with Herculean efforts. But in my view, looking particularly at these principles that just set out the authenticity and accessibility, security, and so on, I feel a lot of that shouldn't be or wasn't really adequately, thought about from a crisis response. And the kind of modes that we adopted, the ways of working we adopted during the initial emergency response shouldn't become best practice long term. There is more that we can do and things that we can do better. And one of those areas that I think is particularly pertinent out of these 5 themes is around accessibility. And now that we're looking at more online exams at stake, and I know we'll be looking at that later, and looking at online exams at scale, things around, how good is technology really? How good is proctoring really for people in different contexts? Are there biases in the software that's being used? What are the kind of downsides, as well as the affordability? So I think that we're still on the kind of journey to trying to make these things happen at scale and making them equitable and accessible for all. But also, I think, and that's maybe my other main point, and then I don't know if Gemma and Paula have comments there as well. I think the continuous assessment piece is becoming more and more urgent as there's more and more people switching careers and switching, whole industries. So continuous learning, lifelong learning, building skills at different stages of your learner journey throughout your life is becoming more and more crucial. And so I think what continuous means now can be a very open-ended question from, one course or one module through, 16 to 18 to 60 to, beyond. So I think that's become an even more interesting space.
And it's interesting because when we were talking before, you referenced 2 things. The first was students' apprehension at continuous assessment because they feel that they're being measured the whole time rather than just in the exam, and also the rise of micro-credentials, which was relatively new at the point when we were talking before, which is absolutely another way of looking at continuous assessment. Have your views on those 2 things changed, do you think?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think nowadays students have a very different relationship to being constantly measured, monitored, online, tracked. We have so much data now that we have about how people learn when. So I think that certainly has shifted a lot because so much more provision is online, and the data that we collect as institutions and, crucially, as platform providers has a very different dimension now. And I think the work that ALT is doing, particularly now reviewing the ethical framework for the use of learning technology, is really crucial in helping institutions make informed decisions. What kind of student data is being collected and how to manage that.
Yeah. Okay. And I suppose the other element, and sorry, Paula and Gemma, I'll let you come in if you would like to in a second. The other elements of that, though, the positive side of the continuous model from a student's perspective is it also gives them a better understanding of where they are at in their journey towards whatever their goal is. And I do think that one of the things with COVID that caught people a lot of people off guard with teacher assessed and centre assessed grades was that really the teacher was making those decisions in a way that made sense to them, but not necessarily to the parents or the students who were, being given the results. And that may be something we can pick up on in a minute, Paula, when we talk a little bit about what good assessment means to students and to parents. But it's that continuous model does have some benefit, doesn't it now? And perhaps students are better understanding that now. Gemma, Paula, any comments in general about whether COVID helped us or didn't in respect to JISC's targets?
Well, I've seen, although it looked amazing during COVID, and we were, as Marion was saying, lots of schools went online, and employers and employees too, and also universities as well. I've seen a rollback at many universities. My partner is a university professor, and he has seen his university here in the Midlands. They've gone back to wanting everything face to face, and I think that's the same with many UK universities, where initially everything was wonderful and we're all going to be online forever and ever, and everyone from all over the world is going to be able to join it. But now we seem to have gone backwards, and I think that is not just within universities, but I think that's happening in assessment with schools and with employers. People have just just want things to be normal again,
Yes.
just for a few years, and they just had enough of everything being online. And we're seeing that, I think, within society, people are buying physical objects more, books, records. Not everybody, of course, but these things are becoming more popular. And I think we need to just bear that in mind, that although we are members of the E-Assessment Association, there's plenty of people out there in the world who don't want to be digital.
Yes, yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. Yeah, the prevalence of online banking and online shopping, that's still there, isn't it? But it is interesting that we sometimes think about our education in a different way, in a different light. Well, but perhaps then just sticking with that thought. I'm coming to you, Paula, specifically on this one. Just thinking about whether we think that the perception of what good assessment looks like has changed as a result of COVID and all the JISC targets, particularly from an educator's and an employer's perspective, but also thinking a little bit about students and parents too as well, which we can come on to in the next question. So yeah, so specifically for educators and employers first. What do you think?
Well, when we say good assessment, I think many employers and the candidates and their parents taking it, thinking of school children, just want an exam result. They want to get a piece of paper with their GCSEs or A levels written on it. And many employers still ask for that physical piece of paper or a scan or a PDF of it, even if they are talking to a candidate who's in their 50s or 60s. They say, have you got your O-level or CSE results? And many people say, well, no, I've lost it. How am I supposed to get that? So so the idea that a good assessment has changed, not really at the end of the day, but saying that, I have just last week I noticed that the language learning employer, Duolingo, which some of you may use yourself for learning languages. I've tried it myself. I'm trying to learn a bit of Welsh at the moment, just for fun. And they announced that they were going to scrap all use of freelance writers to write their language questions on this app and change to AI completely. Now that was a bit of a shock because I think they employ lots and lots of people, hundreds of languages, and I think, well, that could be a useful element of AI, because Duolingo is not that sophisticated. They ask you simple questions to translate and you click on answers. But they will still need to employ, from an employer's point of view, a physical voice, because Duolingo actually you can hear what the language sounds like when you click on a particular word on your screen or your device. Now, I don't think AI is that sophisticated yet to get exact pronunciations of certain words in many languages. And I think that would come across in what would be a good assessment and how that would actually work in practice. Because if we're going to go down automated routes and accessibility routes, we're going to have to start thinking about, can a candidate speak a response to some device and get it recorded? Now, yes, there are text to speech or speech to text devices now, and perhaps you've tried them and they work up to a certain extent. But can you imagine being a 15 or a 16-year-old who's hesitant, nervous, trying to take an exam? Then even writing an answer to an exam question is hard enough. You probably cross it out several times, but speaking it and thinking while you're speaking and trying to be coherent and get your answer down in that way is going to be very, very difficult. And then trying to mark it. So I think, what does a good assessment look like from a student's point of view? They just want it to work. I don't care how sophisticated it is. And I think the same is true for employers. Although they are perhaps using AI in their candidate recruitment principles and being able to sift out CVs and job applications, I think at the end of the day, a good assessment is just something that shows what somebody can do. It doesn't matter how it's been arrived at. People can jump up and down and dance if that's what they want to do, or they can write it down. But as long as somebody knows that's what they can do, I think that's good enough. So I think while schools and universities may want to get carried away with AI and the rest of us getting very excited, I think we have to try and remember that it's the result that counts.
And it sort of comes back to what we said in the previous session about being focused around what we're trying to assess and bettering assessment through the process of change and innovation, doesn't it? So rather than just trying to do whizzy stuff for whizzy stuff's sake, if you like. Gemma, Maren, any additional comments on that particular one?
If you're happy for me to come in there, I think your comments around the language capabilities of AI at the moment are quite interesting, and I don't disagree that in certain languages it is much better than it is in others. But 18 months ago, we could have spotted an AI generated image straight away, particularly around kind of people's hands and that kind of things. I think it's important to bear in mind that AI is moving quickly. So maybe Duolingo are a little bit premature in doing it as early as they have, but equally, I don't think AI is as far away as it may feel like it is in terms of getting that kind of language recognition done in a particularly high level. We're not there yet, but I don't think we're that far away. Equally as well, I do wonder how employers will take what's been advertised, what's been brought up in the news this morning, the new app for providing GCSE results to students, and what impact that may have on the way employers think about exam records and how they use that, and as well the way that colleges and universities then think about the storage of exam records and the impact that will have further down the line.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, isn't it? Because it's great to go to more digital stuff, and as you were saying, Maren, earlier, we can get such great insight from those sort of digital records. But is that what people are going to want, and are they still going to value the bit of paper? I, by the way, know exactly where my A-level and O-level certificates are. I've never had to show them to anyone, but I know where they are. Okay. So, and just sorry, Maren, did you have any other comments on that particular piece? Wonderful, thank you. So just thinking about transformational process. One of the areas, and Paula, you mentioned it earlier, so perhaps I'll stick with you if that's all right on this one, is this idea of moving GCSEs online. So for those of you who aren't familiar with GCSEs, this is the 16-year-olds high stakes exam sat by all 16-year-olds in the UK as a method of moving forward into further education or further studies. And they are resolutely at the moment stuck in the bit of paper, scribbling away for 2 or 3 hours type of modality. But there are now moves afoot to move those online. And you mentioned Wales earlier on, has very, very purposely redesigned their GCSEs to do that. But of course, in England too, some of the big awarding bodies are talking about taking some of those assessments online as well. What do you think that means in relation to thinking about the targets, the JISC targets, of particularly of accessibility and authenticity? What do we think? What do you think that means for those for students and parents? Do you think that's going to give them what they are hoping it's going to give them?
I think we have to just go back and understand what happens with GCSEs and paper exams at the moment, because although students in schools and colleges do actually write on bits of paper, those bits of paper are then all sent off to the awarding bodies within the UK, to a general centre, usually over in Cambridge somewhere, or up in Yorkshire, where they are scanned physically on a scanning machine. So every piece of paper they write on gets scanned, and the answers get converted into a digital format, which is then sent back to the awarding bodies, who then divide these answers up and send them off out online to exam markers, who mark them online, usually not as a whole exam paper, but as individual questions. So an examiner is usually asked to mark, say, 500 or 1,000 question 3s of GCSE history, for example, and that's what they do. Actually, many examiners these days don't actually get to see an entire exam paper answer from one candidate. And that used to be really interesting, because you could see how well in one exam paper, when you marked it on paper or marked an entire paper online, how well the student was doing across the exam paper and how well they were doing. And I think then that you were actually getting quite an authentic answer about what the student was capable of doing. Now, the JISC definition of authentic in their report that we're using today as a format was actually to say, what will the student be moving on to next? So an exam will have to be authentic so that they meet some sort of task or definition of what they will be going on to. Usually the JISC definition was, what would an employer want? What would they be doing in an employment situation? Well, I think really that's a bit of a sideline, because even with vocational exams, which some 16 and 18-year-olds do now, things like hairdressing, bricklaying, things like that, they are authentic assessments, and they will be similar to what an employer would want them to do. But things like academic exams, doing mathematics or doing a scientific formulae, often you're not going to meet those later on unless you are actually going on to higher education in some format, which many students don't do. You know, we think about 50% of students these days going on to university, but there's the other half who don't. And they will probably think, why have I been learning this quadratic equations or the scientific formulae for table salt? I'm never going to meet that again when I'm serving people behind the counter at Marks and Spencer's, or being a computer operator at a call centre for some online returns company or something like that. And they may be happy in this job. I think as assessment specialists, we have to try and remember exams aren't just there to show what an employer wants. They are there to help the student become an adult. We want them to learn things that will prepare their brain to accept more information later on. Now, it may seem strange, and many young people and many parents find it hard to explain, why am I learning about the Corn Laws in history? It's not happening today. Why do I need to learn this? Well, because history repeats itself again and again and again, and we're seeing that in assessment. Assessments want to be changed again and again and again, and yes, they will be, and the way we use them and deliver them will be changed. We'll start to meet more exciting things that students can do. If we go to online, we'll be able to videos, they'll be able to perhaps paint on computers rather than painting with a paintbrush, and that will be a completely different expression of their artistic temperament if they're painting on a piece of software. And I've seen some really incredible results of people using software to paint. It's really exciting, and you think, well, that's going to be the future, and perhaps we need to remember that yes, digital assessment's going to change. Everyone needs to be involved, and I think we all need to think, how are we going to do that? And but I think as we can become siloed as assessment specialists, particularly someone like myself, an examiner, and forget that down the line the employees and employers want something completely different. But we're not actually all completely different. We are all trying to get there in the same way, but I think it may take a bit of time.
Okay. No, thank you for that. Maren, Gemma, any comments on this, and maybe, sorry, Maren, go on.
I was just going to say, I think, Paula, what you just said really resonates with me around, assessments do have to align and prepare students for employment, and whatever that might look like. But that isn't everything, and we are trying to, develop skills and capabilities to learn more in different scenarios, develop critical as well as functional literacies. And I feel that in an age of where we have information abundance, the faculty to learn more, to critically analyze, to be more nuanced in our understanding of all of that information is so crucial, and it doesn't always seem functional. So I think you made that point really beautifully just now, and I think it's easy to lose sight of that.
It really is. And actually, if you look at I was just reflecting on that, because I've never really thought about it that way, about trying to help students to be better learners as they develop and as they grow, and to have to absorb information better as they grow, because the press and a lot of commentators often focus on the fact that we're not teaching them soft skills, and we're not making them employable, and we're not doing this and that, and obviously those things become more important the further in your learning journey you go, as you progress into FE, and workplace learning. But as we were talking specifically about GCSEs, that the definition of authenticity is different at that particular point. Gemma, I'm just moving on to the next question, which is linked to this. I was just wondering whether there is an appetite for a similar change to seeing exams more delivered more online in FE, HE, and work-based learning, and how that's actually progressing across those sectors.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think if we start in FE, I mean, FE institutions have had digital examinations in place, so in specific education settings, running quite effectively for quite some time now, with tools like Secure Assess from City and Guilds, for example, that has been around a very, very long time. In terms of kind of the HE sector, there are a plethora of tools that allow you to do different kinds of online, in place, on campus, whatever permutation you want, things that in terms of assessment, things like feedback fruits, for example, and their peer review tool would be one of those. But I think we see a lot more kind of digital assessments in a formative sense in universities than we do in a summative sense. And I think part of this is fueled by the wish to complete examinations on campus due to limitations of space, the amount of digital infrastructure required to deal with cohort sizes of 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 students in one go, all sitting the same exam at the same time, which is not the kind of numbers that, say, FE are dealing with, or even the kind of numbers that schools are dealing with in individual locations, rather than in terms of a national kind of structure. And so I think paper exams is something that is kind of seen as a way to manage those issues of space, and universities definitely aren't as far ahead in that scanning of examination and that marking online in to the same level that GCSEs are. So I think we'll see that becomes a growing area, particularly for universities, as we start to look at that need to handle much larger cohort sizes. And as well, I think we'll find that because of that, there's also that kind of, there is in the background that reluctance with AI. And there's a feeling, particularly at university level, that by doing something on paper, we can mitigate those issues. We can mitigate the concerns around an online exam that's being taken off campus in the way that they had to be done in COVID. We can avoid the need to use proctoring tools that in and of themselves have privacy issues, accessibility concerns that many universities, including my own, have outright said we're not using because of that. And it avoids the need to look at expensive lockdown software that requires additional training. So I can see that there will be more of a movement towards script scanning. But equally, there are the online courses that require those online assessments and still require those digital exams. And I can still see a lot of summative assessments being done with a lot of those digital tools that support very specific, very situational type summative assessments, like peer review and group member evaluation.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, and I'm trying to hold myself back from taking us off in different directions when we bring some of this stuff up, because we want to try and keep the focus around the principles that the JISC report brought to bear. But it is interesting. One of my little pet niggles is that sectors don't often share information very well. So your point about the FE sector having been doing digital assessments for a while, the same is true in the work-based assessment. So I'm doing some work at the moment, some consultancy for a chartered institute. They've been delivering on-screen exams for 20 years, and they don't think twice about it. It's just that's what they do. But we don't seem to be very good at sharing information across those sectors and learning from each other. That's okay. I'll get off my soapbox now. But that was just it's just a niggle that's come up all the time. I wondered whether, and I'm going slightly off piece, so apologies. I'm wondering whether then we and this will lead us into the next question. So AI has come up a few times. And we'll come into look at a minute whether that's a threat or an enabler. But is it something, do you think, then, that is driving people backwards in terms of the way that they try the modality of the assessment, not so much what they're assessing, but taking them back to the pen and paper because it's a way of securing against the AI? Is that sort of what you're saying, Gemma?
That's exactly what I'm saying. I think there are always those people that want to kind of embrace AI, but I also think that there are those people that are fearful, and rightly so. There are lots of concerns around AI. There are ethical concerns and other considerations to think of, and it's very much like Paula was saying earlier about COVID-19 and people wanting to go back to using records and those kind of things. I feel like there's a safety in paper that some people go for. And it's the same with any new technology. I was reminded earlier this week by my husband talking about how when cars were first invented, you couldn't go faster than 5 miles per hour and someone had to walk in front of you with a light. And almost I feel like that's where we are with AI. We've got these people who really want to try it and really want to run away with it, and that's fantastic. But we've also got these this section of people who are fearful and who need to talk through it, need to look at it, and need to see actually what impact is this going to have on me and on my assessment before barreling forward.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I like that. The flag waver in front of any AI that's being used in education. Yeah, that's interesting. So sticking with AI for a minute, Maren, I was curious to understand what your thoughts are around AI and how far the changes that AI enable us to provide will take us in terms of what we assess and how we assess students.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly the buzzword of the moment right now, and for those of us who remember like the year of the MOOC in 2012, when the end of education as we knew it was happening right there, and I think we're always in a sort of hype cycle, and at the moment with AI, it's like I don't remember quite the Gartner hype cycle terminology, but I think it's like the peak of inflated expectation or something where we are right now, what will solve all the problems. But the reality is that I think we just need to conceptualize this whole range of tools from analog, pen and paper, all the way through all the digital pieces to AI. And employees of the future and all of us will have to adapt to having a whole range. And I think that applies to learning and teaching and work just as much as it does to assessment. The real issue is, and I think we're coming on to that maybe in another question later, is around the issues around academic integrity. If I can ask ChatGPT to write my essay for me, there are some practical issues around exams, but I think there's also a sort of bigger issue that we have, which is that some of these tools are fantastic for experienced learners who have a large body of knowledge to judge what they're getting and how to use it and how to work with it. I think younger learners, or maybe people who are new to a subject, are having a much harder time to interrogate what they get back from AI. Is it complete hallucination? Is it true at all? Are any of these references true? And there is usually so many that you don't look at each one of them. And I think that is one, to go back to the JISC principles, I think that is an issue that goes around the authenticity and accessibility, but also the security. Now, if we are just regurgitating potentially wrong information to each other and then have that assessed by AI, it could be sort of a virtuous circle of no one ever doing an essay, marking an essay, assessing an essay, or feeding back on an essay, because it's all done by machines. And in my view, learning is a human endeavor. No matter what tools we use, I think human beings, need to be at the center of what we are having for.
I agree. Yeah, no, that's really good points. Thank you for that. And I think it is interesting that pollution, if you like, of the learning by getting misinformation is one of those key things that we've got to try and figure out how to avoid. And we will touch on this in a little bit, because one of these skills that I think we need to encourage people to learn, though, is how to interpret the information that they get from AI. And there is a school of thought that says, well, if you don't expose them to AI through the learning and assessment journey, how are they ever going to learn how to do that properly? And so it leads me on to my next question, Gemma, if I can take this one to you. And we've touched on this a little bit already, but this is about whether we think educational establishments should embrace AI or run away screaming with the little flag man running away in front of them to keep them at a safe distance. What do you think about that? Should we be embracing it?
I think this is a really interesting question, and I think it can very quickly become very situationally specific. I think there are definitely some cases and some examples where you really don't want AI involved in a specific assessment. I'm thinking things such as the medical licensing assessment for as a starting point, but there are many others that you could kind of put into that category. And then there are others where it may actually benefit from using AI to support that understanding of the critical thinking, and to support people to kind of differentiate between misinformation provided by it, and to understand actually how AI might be being used in the workplace, and to prepare people for that future workplace as well. And that links back to those ideas around authenticity that came up in the original JISC study. I think the opinion, and it's particularly in universities at the moment, has led to assessment designs that aim to kind of limit the level to which AI can be used. We see a lot of traffic light systems. There's the 5-step one from Deakin University, Australia. I think more commonly seen now as the AAS model. And then the 3-step one from the University of Leeds. I do feel in a way that from a future-proofing perspective, that these kind of traffic lights are going to be stopgaps. And I feel like we're going to move much more towards what Sydney has moved to recently, which is the 2-lane model, where you've got the assessments that absolutely cannot have AI involved. They're fully invigilated so that you can be absolutely certain that AI isn't involved in any other in any way. And then you've got everything else, where you can't necessarily police what level of AI is being used, because we haven't got tools that are robust enough to be able to tell us that yet. I mean, we've got things like the Turnitin originality scores and the AI detector, which has been routinely proven to be either inaccurate or to be biased against particular users, and many people have chosen to turn off. Our university is one of them, because of those issues. I think as well, as AI moves forward, we'll see that those limited assessments we'll see that demarcation more. And I think it's important to say, I would kind of want to plug the SIG a little bit here. So the special interest group has looked at this in a fair amount of detail in one of our first webinars, which I have provided the link to, which hopefully will be shared after this meeting, where we look at AI policy at different institutions. We look at the idea of assessing process over product, and that's a discussion that's coming up at the moment. So again, that leads into that continuous assessment idea as opposed to that endpoint assessment idea. And then looking at how AI is affecting that relationship between both staff and students where assessment is concerned, and what impact that's having on the way that people are assessing. But I think returning back to the question overall, I think those areas where assessment security needs to be completely fully assured, then we should be restricting the use of AI. And the only way to do that is under strict invigilated conditions. In those areas where we can be a bit more flexible, and where AI could be embraced or is being used in the workplace, then I think actually, yes, maybe we should be embracing that and preparing students for the future world that they're going to be going into. So, I mean, really, it's not an either or situation. It's what is most appropriate to the thing that you're assessing.
Yes, that's a really good point, actually, because it's all about that, going back to the point we made right at the beginning about making sure that we're using technology to better the assessment process rather than just doing it for its own sake. And one of the things that I'm picking up here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we're sort of looking at a number of different assessment lenses that we're looking at the student through, and those might be in the high stakes scenario quite secure invigilated type assessments, and in lower stakes or more formative continuous kinds of positions, we're using more innovative approaches. I'm just curious, before we I am conscious of time, but just before we jump to the next question, Paul, I'm just curious. So several years ago, the then CEO of Cambridge Assessment got sacked for suggesting that Google, that the students should have Google in the exam. Do you think there's ever likely to be the opportunity for Google, or I mean, Google is an AI tool, but for more advanced technology tools to coexist with a GCSE exam in terms of allowing students to research stuff as they're answering. Do you think that's a possibility? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I think it's a possibility, but are students ready and able to do it? Because we think of young people, basically anyone under the age of 25. That's what I think of as a young person today. We think of them as digitally native, as the old-fashioned term went. They're using it all the time. But are they? Are they all out there using AI every day? Well, if we look at the statistics, Ofqual, that is the qualifications regulator for the English exams in schools, they measured for the first time in the summer last year's exams for GCSEs and A-levels, they measured for the first time how many students used AI to cheat, or in their terms, malpractice. And they came up with a number of 85 cases out of a total of 17.6 million exam entries that year.
Wow.
So I don't think we need to get too excited that students are going to be out there using AI every day all the time. I think some people are, and I think some of the students who are really into exams and want to know how to use digital tools all the time will be using it, and they would love to be able to use it. But I think the vast majority of students just aren't ready for it yet.
No. And I suppose you could argue there's a difference between your average 16-year-old and your average 21, 22-year-old in HE studying who are maybe perhaps a little more capable with the technology for cheating purposes. It does neatly segue us into the next question, which, Maren, I'm going to bring to you, but I am conscious of time, so I'm going to ask you to be quite concise with your thoughts on this one, which is, to what extent can the continuous assessment model and enhanced assessment security help prevent cheating? And is cheating in the traditional sense always a bad thing? And we've talked a little bit about this already, but that's a big question to ask you to answer quickly, so apologies.
I'll do my best. And I think Gemma has already pointed to all the ways in which this is being explored and what the range, of that answer looks like. There's a whole rainbow of possibility, what we might see long term, and redefining academic integrity and how we enforce that. But I think what it really gets down to is what Paula just mentioned, which is AI and digital literacies for staff and for students. We need to help staff develop the right skills to design assessment and to assess appropriately now that AI tools are available so widely. And similarly, we need to teach students, and I think Paula is right, we need to ensure the critical elements of digital literacies are really strong so that students know when to use tools and when not to.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. That was very, very concise and spot on. So I'm going to just ask a yes or no question here, and I'm going to put this to all of you. Gemma, you were going to spend a bit more time unpacking this, but we haven't really got it, so apologies. I'm getting the sense that the JISC principles are still relevant today, 5 years on, and they should still be things that we're trying to focus on and use in our assessments. Do you agree? Yes or no? Let me start with you, Gemma, since this was originally going to be your question.
I'm going to say for the most part, yes.
Okay.
But there is just one particular one I want to highlight, and that's appropriate automation. And that's because I don't think that it really covers where we are now and what we can do now in terms of automation and AI. And I think it needs to be reconsidered with the technological advances that we've had in the past 5 years, and brought up to where we are now and where we may be in 5 years' time.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Maren, any yes or no thoughts?
I think I agree completely with Gemma. Excellent point.
Excellent. Thank you. Paula?
I say yes. I think the 5 points that JISC made are still absolutely relevant, but I think their definitions need to be widened quite a bit as things are moving on.
Thank you for that. And the one thing that I think might be argued that is missing, but this could be a whole topic, another topic, is validity, because we hear validity banded around in assessment circles all the time, but actually that doesn't really feature as a key principle in the JISC piece, and perhaps it should moving forward. I'm going to let you all off the making predictions piece in the interest of time, because we are coming up right on the hour. Thank you all very, very much for joining us today, for sharing your thoughts and reflections on the JISC report. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. And apologies to people we weren't able to get to the questions about that have been put in the comments section. Hopefully you've enjoyed the discussion too, and please do join us again for another EAA webinar very soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.